Well, welcome to tonight's presentation. My name's Chrissy, and I'm with the Friends of Netarts Bay Watershed Estuary Beach and Sea, which we affectionately abbreviate to be Friends of Netarts Bay Webs, or just Webs altogether. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, we're a small nonprofit dedicated to sustaining the Netarts Bay area through education and stewardship. So the way we do that is we fundraise to bring learning opportunities to the community. Those go towards welcoming school groups out in the natural environment for outdoor learning opportunities, as well as to bring out the general public to learn about different events and different things around in our watersheds, estuaries, beaches, and seas. We also try to engage the public in science research and actionable stewardship projects that can serve this beautiful place that we live in. We attempt to do all this for free, so there's no barriers to participate. We just strongly believe that if we connect locals and visitors to the wonders of Netarts Bay, that they will learn to love it. And we think that if you love a place, then you will take better care of it as you're living, playing, or working here. Now, we typically like to do these things on the beach or in a kayak or on a trail, or as with clamming on the mud flats. But of course, we're living in some unusual times these days, and that's not really an option for us. And so here we are hosting our first ever live virtual event. Usually this weekend would be our Sustainable Clamming on the Bay weekend. And we've been doing this with Dr. Tony D'Andrea from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for some time now. I don't know, what is it, 7 years, Tony?
Yeah, 7 years.
We're pretty bummed to be missing it. And this year, Tony and I kind of brainstormed on some additional opportunities that we could bring. One would be a presentation that we're bringing to you tonight that allows you to learn more in depth about clams in Netarts Bay. But we also wanted to host an opportunity for people to learn how to deal with the clams once they got them. And so we're actually going to be able to we won't be able to take you out clamming to teach you how to clam, but we can help you dive deeper into clam ecology in Netarts Bay with Tony. And then tomorrow we'll actually take you to the Schooner Restaurant in Netarts so that you can learn some basics about how to handle clams once you have them, and how you can get fresh clams now, even if you can't go out and harvest them yourself. Just want to give you a little background on Tony. Tony is the project leader for the Sea Corps project, which stands for Shellfish and Estuarine Assessment of Coastal Oregon. And this project looks at assessing different bay clam populations in different bays along Oregon, as well as doing research on things like eelgrass populations and clam ecology. They use all this data to inform management, as well as to make up some really great guides for the public that help you understand where you can go clamming. Tony's been with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife since 2010, and he's had an academic career at Oregon State University, but also at, which I didn't know, the University of the Virgin Islands. He's still associated with OSU through a courtesy faculty position with the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you for joining us, Tony.
Yep, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. I hope everyone who's virtually attending is safe and healthy. This is a challenging time for all Oregonians. As Chrissy noted, in a different year, I would be sharing this talk the evening before an in-person clamming clinic in Netarts Bay. Obviously, that's not currently possible. So in discussions with Chrissy and Webbs, we decided to kind of provide the same information about clams and clamming, but do it virtually. So this will be one of 3 talks that we kind of have planned to share over the next month or so. So tonight's talk will be a general guide to clamming in Oregon with a focus on clamming areas in Netarts Bay. Talk 2 will be on the ecology and population of clams in Netarts Bay and how ODFW manages clam fisheries. And then our 3rd talk will be on the ecology of eelgrass in Netarts Bay and the importance of that habitat to clams and other shellfish. So before I start the talk today, I want to take a few minutes to talk about COVID-19 impacts on recreational clamming. So first, you should be aware that there are a number of closures that impact access to clamming locations. So right now, clamming is currently closed to non-Oregon residents. State parks are closed, and this includes camping areas, viewpoints, access points, and parking areas. And Tillamook County has also closed many access points and parking areas that limits access to many of the clamming areas that are found in the county. And obviously, speaking on behalf of ODFW, we know that this limits some of the recreational outdoor opportunities during the governor's stay-in-place order. We are asking that sport clammers comply with the state, county, and city closures, that you not travel long distances to get to a clamming spot on the coast, and practice safe social distancing while out on the tide flats and parking areas. The ODFW's Shellfish program has been monitoring sport clamming along the coast, and in general, people have been pretty good about safe social distancing. We as an agency are trying to balance keeping recreational opportunities open with the governor's executive order to avoid having to shut down any of the fishing or shellfishing available in the state. And so I just wanted to say that we certainly appreciate the efforts to date by sport climbers to keep these fisheries open in these challenging times. So just want to make it clear that all the information I'll be sharing with you today and in future talks will still be applicable later in the near future, when the restrictions are going to be lifted and we can go back out more regularly clamming in the bays. So let's talk about clamming. In my talk tonight, I'll give a brief overview of the ODFW Shellfish program, introduce the Seeker project that I run within the Shellfish program, highlight a number of different information sources you can use to find information about clams and clamming in Oregon. The bulk of the talk will be a brief guide to clamming that will cover a broad spectrum of things, but essentially what you should know about clams and the areas that you're going to clamming before you go out to ensure a successful clamming experience. And then at the end of the talk, as Chrissy mentioned, we'll be using the comments to address any questions that people may have about the topics of the talk or clams and Netarts Bay in general. So the main responsibility of the Shellfish program is to manage shellfish resources and their habitats. This includes both recreational and commercial fisheries in the state. We have a number of research programs that can be broken down into two types. Fisheries monitoring research, which includes things like creel surveys on the tide flats as well as commercial landings, and then resource assessments, such as those that my project is involved in. Our responsibility covers a broad range of species, so not just clams and crabs, but urchins, bait shrimp, abalone. Essentially, we're responsible for most invertebrates that occur in estuaries and in the nearshore coastal ocean. We also study the habitats where these species exist, since we do our purview as ODFW is for the species themselves as well as the habitats that they utilize. We conduct numerous outreach activities to promote understanding of shellfish resources and opportunities in the state. And we also spend a portion of our time coordinating with other state, federal, and local agencies and governments about issues that are relevant to Oregon estuaries and shellfish. You know, one of the simplest examples I can give is for Oregon State Police, which enforces the shellfish regulations. So as Chrissy mentioned, I run the Shellfish and Estuarine Assessment of Coastal Oregon, or Seeker project. The goals of this project are to generate baseline data for all Oregon estuaries on bay clam populations, track changes in these populations, and inform the public. Examples of the types of data that are generated by the project include things like stock assessments for bay clams, habitat mapping, and public outreach materials. So one of the main outreach materials that my project produces that I'll show parts of today and that Chrissy mentioned is that we do these brochures that are clamming maps based on the surveys that we do in all the bays that we've surveyed. So the overall goal here is to have the best available data for the state to better manage estuarine resources and the shellfish resources of the state. So to date, the Seeker project has surveyed 6 major estuaries, and we just started our second survey of Tillamook Bay, which was the first bay that we started surveying back in 2010. So before we start, I want to give you an idea of the types of resources where you can find information on clams and clamming in Oregon. We have a number of resources in ODFW offices or online. These include things like brochures and clamming maps, informational reports about shellfish, sport fishing regulation books, tide tables. These are all useful tools for a clamming experience. On the web, there are resources both on the My ODFW page and the ODFW Shellfish Program websites. And finally, there are a number of other resources that are available to the public to utilize for information on clams and clamming. So these are things like the weekly recreation report, asking questions of staff and at the local offices, and external sources such as YouTube, iFish, and others that people have used to get information about clamming and clamming methods. So now you know where to find information. I wanted to give you a little background on clams and some basics of things you should know before you head out for a day of clamming. In this section of the talk, I'll cover basic clam biology, species identification, regulations, and then what you need to know, and where and when to go. I'll also touch on a few safety issues that you should be aware of to ensure a successful and safe clamming experience. So there are 7 major bay clams that make up the bulk of clamming effort in the state. And this includes both native and non-native clams that are found in Oregon's estuaries. The 4 native clams, cockles, butters, native littlenecks, and gapers are the primary targets for sport clammers. However, there are also several non-native species that are also harvested recreationally. They include the purple varnish clam, the softshell or eastern softshell, and in Netarts Bay, the manila littleneck. And just a quick aside on the manila littleneck is that this is the species you would commonly see in the grocery stores and seafood markets as steamer clams. Most of them are farmed littlenecks from Washington State. So before you head out for the day, you should also know the shellfish regulations for the species that you're targeting on your clamming adventure. There should be bright yellow signs with regulations near most public access sites along the coast. The key components of the regulations include that a shellfish license is required for those who are 12 and over. You must have your own container for your clams, that there are limits that differ among the species. And so I have the 4 main kind of divisions of limits between bay clams, of which you can take 20 clams per day, of which only 12 of those 20 clams can be gaper clams. For soft shell and other clams, you can have 36 per day, and that's in addition to the bay clam limit. And then purple varnish clams is 72 per day, and for razor clams, it's the first 15 taken. All the information and these regulations is available on the ODFW website. One additional regulation that's applicable for Netarts Bay is that you should also be aware of closed areas in the bays that you are harvesting clams. For example, Netarts Bay has a shellfish preserve in a portion of the bay where it is illegal to harvest clams. And I'll show you where that's located later in the talk. So during the life of a bay clam, they spend time in the water column, which is called a pelagic stage, and in tidal flat sediments, or the benthic stage of their life. The basic life cycle is similar for all the species that we'll talk about today. So bay clams are broadcast spawners in that the males and females release sperm and egg into the water column, which is then fertilized. And then they spend a number of weeks in their early development as free-swimming larvae, passing through a number of different larval stages. And so a lot of this time they can be spent within the estuary waters or even in the coastal ocean. And then this last pedovillager stage is when they start building a shell, and that's when they're gonna start to metamorphose and then settle to the bottom as these juvenile clams that look a lot like little versions of the adults that we go clamming on. And then these clams grow in the intertidal and subtidal areas of the bays until they reach sexual maturity and reproduce, restarting this cycle. So the species that those 7 species I talked about differ based on the time of year when they spawn, the amount of time spent in the water column, and the time it takes to grow into mature clams. So this has lots of implications for species that you find either annually or in different parts of the bay, when there are good years and bad years, because obviously they're going to be in the coastal ocean. So lots of the things that we've been seeing as far as impacts to the coastal ocean influences clam populations as well. And when you would expect to find smaller clams found in the tide flats. So there are a number of things to know before you go out clamming to have a successful clamming experience. And so these include things like, which clams are you going to go after? What depths do they live in the sediment? Where are they found? Where on the intertidal beach are you likely to find them? And what clamming tools should be used? And then just as importantly is, what is that low tide? So I know what time I need to go out. So I'll talk about each of these topics over the next several slides. So let's start talking a little bit about which clams you're targeting. This figure shows the 6 major recreational clams found in Netarts Bay and the depth where they typically live in the sediments. The colored bar next to each of the clam denotes the approximate depths where they are typically found on the tide flat. Another way to think about this is how deep you need to dig to find the clam. For example, there are shallow dwelling species such as cockles and little necks that are found pretty much within the first 6 inches, up to gapers that can be found 3 feet or more deep. And so you'd have to dig a lot more to get to a gaper relative to some of the other species. The clam or clams you're going after help you figure out everything else you need to know before you head out for the day. Clams live at different depths below the surface, but they also live in different tide heights on the beach. What tide you need to get the clam that you're interested in depends on, which of those clams that you're interested in. This figure shows an idealized estuarine beach going from the upper shoreline on the right down the beach into subtidal channels. And these deep channels that are rarely or never actually exposed at low tide. And so these are called subtidal areas. And the rest of these portions of the beach would be called intertidal areas. I've included approximate tide heights for each of these regions. And these would be the same tide heights that you would read from a table. And so what I've put here for Netarts Bay is some of the generalized tide heights where you would find different species of clams. So gapers are generally found low in the intertidal and need a 0 or negative tide to harvest. Other species like cockles and butters are found a little bit higher in the intertidal, and they can be dug on days with moderate low tides of 0 to +1 feet. The common height where a particular species is found will help you determine if the tide that day will be good enough for you to be able to harvest that clam. But a good rule of thumb, and I bring this up a couple of times, is that targeting the lowest low tides in a month which will occur every 2 weeks on the full or new moon. So what tools do you need? So there are 3 main tools that are used for clamming: shovels, rakes, and more recently, shrimp guns. So I'll talk a little bit about the equipment, but first I want to also let you know that you need the basics. So you'll need boots or waders, gloves, and your bucket or mesh bag to store the clams you dig. Some people also like to have bamboo stakes or dowels if they're digging gapers, because it allows them to kind of track where the gaper is relative to where they're digging. The other tools you need depend on what you're harvesting. And so shovels are good for just about any clam that are not found right at the surface. And so gapers and butters are a good example for shovels. Rakes can be used for shallow dwelling species like cockles and littlenecks. And then finally, shrimp guns are good for digging up gapers. They can dig a hole by, instead of you having to physically move all that sand, you can liquefy the sand with the shrimp gun. And this is a newer approach, but many like it because it's a lot less labor intensive to get to a deep hole to find a gaper, and has less of an impact on the clam habitat since you don't have a big pile of sand that digging with a shovel creates. So right now, gapers would be the species that the shrimp gun can be used to harvest. When we talk about identifying clams for digging, what we really mean is identifying the clam show. So let me kind of talk about what that is. And again, we'll have to talk a little bit about clam biology. So clams are suspension feeders. That is, that they pump water into their shells, use their gills to sort out food, usually small marine algae called phytoplankton. They pump water using a pair of siphons, one where the water comes in called the inhalant siphon, and one where the water pumps out on the exhalant siphon. So the water comes in, goes across the gills sort out for food, and then the non-food particles then get kicked out of the exhalant siphon. So if you were to look at what a siphon looks when there's water over a tide flat, so here's a gaper siphon, and so you see the 2 siphons, that the inhalant and exhalant siphons look clear, but that's not what you see at low tide, because obviously without water over the tide flat, the clam is not going to have its siphons out visible. Instead, it pulls it back into the sediment. And so this is what a gaper siphon looks like at low tide. And so we call this a show because it's some characteristic feature on the sediment surface that's based upon the structure of the siphon itself. In the case of gapers, these siphons are fused together as one, so when it pools back at low tide, it just looks like a single siphon there. Typically, the shape of the siphon and whether or not the siphons are fused together can create this characteristic feature. So let's talk about some of these shows. So we talked about the gaper show already. It appears as an approximately quarter-sized circular show on larger gapers. And then you may or may not see the siphon like we have in this photo. So this right here is the actual gaper siphon that you can see. It may be just below the surface where you can't see it. Often you can poke your finger down the hole and feel the gaper clam retract the siphon away from your hand. And this is a good method to be sure that that there's actually a gaper there before you start digging. Other clams have different types of shows and sizes. So cockles have unfused siphons. So now their show at the surface has 2 small holes, and you can see relative to a dime that those holes are fairly small. Usually they're at or just beneath the surface, so you can test with your fingers whether or not the cockle is there by just feeling for the shell. Butters have a more oval or keyhole shaped burrow show that's approximately dime sized or smaller, depending on the size of the clam. Purple varnish clams can be challenging to identify by their burrow show since their siphons are quite small. So here are two siphon holes of a purple varnish clam relative to a diamond. You can see they're quite small and often hard to see in the sand that they live in. And I'll also show you in a moment another challenge to finding purple varnish clams by other animals that live on the tide flat that have holes that are very similar to that. And then finally, the softshell clams have an approximately circular burrow show that is smaller than the gaper clam. Large softshells have a burrow show about the size of a dime. A common mistake by newer clammers is mistaking burrowing shrimp burrows for clam burrows. There are two burrowing shrimp that can occur in estuaries, ghost shrimp here on the left and mud shrimp on the right. Ghost shrimp can occur with purple varnish clams and soft shells. And so this is kind of all burrows of the ghost shrimp. And so you can see that these are, again, these small holes that could be confused for the purple varnish clam. So how can you tell the difference? Well, often the burrowing shrimp, the ghost shrimp burrows have a small mound next to the burrow opening. And if you push your finger in the hole and see water coming out of a couple other burrow openings, or you see active pumping of water out of the burrows, then you can be pretty sure that that's ghost shrimp and not a clam burrow. Mud shrimp burrows are often confused with gaper burrows, since they too can be large circular shaped openings of about the same size as you would expect a gaper clam show. However, the easiest way to identify them relative to gapers is to stick your finger down the burrow. If you feel a siphon retract, then you have a gaper. If instead you feel a smooth, almost slippery lining in the burrow, then it is a mud shrimp. Other indications are similar ghost shrimp with water coming out of multiple openings or active pumping of the water being visible. Those are more indications of a mud shrimp relative to a gaper. So I want to take a moment and talk about clamming etiquette. Clamming is a fun recreational activity and a great way to bring home dinner, but you should remember that there are a lot of other animals that live and feed in areas where you go clamming. There are several things you can do as a clammer to reduce your impact and be a good steward for the bay. One thing we ask is for people to refill their holes. A pile of sand can smother nearby clams. You may want to dig another day. The tides do not move enough sand to displace large piles. And keep in mind that smaller clams and other invertebrates that are important to the estuary cannot dig through these large piles. Eelgrass is another thing that we want to ask you to avoid digging in. You can see it in the photos as these broad leaves here around this is a cute little juvenile Dungeness crab here. Eelgrass is an important habitat for many estuarine species, especially juvenile salmon, such as the Chinook salmon shown here, is a major feeding area of wading birds, such as the great blue heron, and important for many invertebrate species, such as Dungeness crab and numerous invertebrates. This video here, all of these little guys moving are all little baby Dungeness crabs that just settled. And so there's tens of thousands of Dungeness crabs that are settling here in this eelgrass bed. And so obviously, again, if you have a big pile of sand or you're actively digging in this area, that you could cause real impacts to the young crabs and other invertebrates in this. So we ask you to avoid digging within the eelgrass, and you just dig along the edges or gaps in the eelgrass. There are plenty of clams in these areas, so you'll still have a successful clamming without impacting eelgrass out there. Another thing we ask is that you know where to go when you go out clamming so that you have a successful clamming trip and have the least impact out on the bay. So instead of just digging everywhere on the tide flat, you're going in an area you know there are clams, and so your impact is much more focused in an area where you're actively getting clams out of those holes. And so, as I mentioned before, one of the things that we'll talk about in a little bit is some of these clamming maps that my project produced for clammers to take out in the field with them. so that they're going to spots where clams do occur within the estuary. And finally, when you're in an area where clams are abundant, we ask that you resist the temptation to dig up all of them in a small area. As I noted earlier, clams are broadcast spawners, so males and females need to be near each other to reproduce and make the next generation of clams for us to enjoy. So when you are in these dense patches, just dig several clams from that dense area and then move on to a different location. That way we can assure there are abundant clams for the next year and for future generations of Oregonians, so we can all enjoy clamming as an activity. So now you know what clams you're going after, how deep they live, where they're found, the tools you need, and how to identify them. Armed with this knowledge, now you need to know when you can actually go clamming. And so this figure here is a standard tide chart. This is actually the tide chart for Netarts Bay for tomorrow morning, when we would have normally been going out. But in Oregon and much of the West Coast, we have two low tides during the day. One is a lower low tide than the other. And similarly, we have two high tides during a day, one which is higher than the other. And so in the case of clamming, you're trying to target these lower low tides, preferably below 0 feet. And so this is the one for tomorrow morning, which is at about 9:30 in the morning at minus 0.3 feet. So this would be a good clamming tide. So good clamming tides are those that are less than 0 feet. And then the preference from a safety perspective is clamming an hour before and after the low tide, and then getting out of that location. In the Pacific Northwest, the incoming tides can come in quite fast. So you should be aware of the incoming tide, since it often comes in faster than you think, and then you'll have to fight currents to go back. And I ask that people try not to push it, even if they're very familiar with the location. So even on this day, so if you were to clam for the hour after that low tide, you're now at a 0 tide, but an hour later, the water's already risen a foot. And then the hour after that, it rises 2 feet. And so you can see how you could be put into a very dangerous situation if you're not paying attention to your surroundings. And so don't be this person, please. Although that's actually one of my staff. But now let's talk about where to clam in Netarts Bay. Part 2 of the Clams in Netarts Bay talk that I'll be giving in several weeks will have more details on the clam populations. Tonight I'll focus on 3 areas on the east side of the bay, all of which can be accessed on foot. And so the first area I'll talk about is Happy Camp, which is on this northern section of the bay near the mouth. The upper part of the beach at Happy Camp is sandy, but the lower beach down in this area is a mix of sand, cobble, and bedrock. And this mixed habitat is where you'll find most of the clams here. And I'll show you which clams shortly, what you'll find there. The access point here is a gravel parking lot at the end of Happy Camp Road here at this blue X here. And there's another potential access point over by the boat launch area where there's a small gravel lot here, and you can access the beach directly. And for both of these, you'll then have to walk to the clamming area. Jeger Creek here in the middle part of the bay is the most popular recreational climbing area in the bay. This area is a broad sandy intertidal beach with areas of native eelgrass. There are 2 areas to access the tide flat that also have shellfish information kiosks, so they're marked here by these blue stars. And then you then have to walk out, and I'll show you when I show you the clam populations that this is the area that most clammers go out to. So this area is accessible is located on Whiskey Creek Road, and it's just down the road from the Netarts boat launch, and also accessible from Oregon 131, either coming from Oceanside or from Tillamook. And then finally, the third site is Whiskey Creek tide flat. And this is located just south of the Jaeger Creek tide flat. It is muddier than the other recreational areas, and burrowing shrimp populations are common in this area, and there are large beds of eelgrass as well in this region. You can access this area from a large gravel lot that is located next to the Whiskey Creek shellfish hatchery, so that's down in this location. And then right south of this location is where that shellfish preserve is located, where you're not permitted to harvest clams. And so if you walk out onto the tide flat, you see this stream come out, which is Whiskey Creek. And so if you just start out on the north side of that creek, then you'll be sure to be outside of the shellfish preserve. So what types of clams do you find? Well, in Happy Camp, 3 major recreational clams occur there. The main site, again, is this cobble bedrock area, and it's about a quarter-mile walk from both access points, whether the Happy Camp or further down south here at the beach access to get there. By far, the largest populations of clams found there are gapers. And so here you can see that within this area here is very large population of gapers, where you find over 20 gapers per square meter in this cobbly area down here. However, it's only available during good negative low tides. And we also ask that you be careful of your footing here, since there's a lot of macroalgae in this cobble and bedrock area, which can make it quite slippery to walk around. For Jeger Creek, one of the reasons it's popular is essentially all of the 4 major recreational clams are found here. And again, the location where most of these populations of clams are located here in this northwest region of this tide flat, around a native eelgrass bed here. And so this is about a half mile walk from these main access areas out to that major clamming area. All 4 species are found, but butter clams are the most abundant. There are regions here where butter clams can be found in densities of 20 to 60 butter clams per square meter, so super abundant here. There are many of these dense patches of butter clams. So remember what I said earlier about leaving some behind in each of these patches, because you could easily then move around and find multiple patches there and quickly get your limit of clams. So the Whiskey Creek area is a little bit more challenging area to clam. The tide flat is much muddier than the other clamming areas and is harder to walk, since your boots will sink a bit on every step. There are 3 types of clams found here: little necks, cockles, and butters. However, most of the cockles and butters are a fair walk from the Whiskey Creek access point down here. So you see that's a pretty big walk to do in this area, especially with how muddy it is. It would be a lot of work to get out there. So most folks that are clamming for cockles and butters tend to come in by boat on this side of the bay and then clam for them up there. Most of the folks that are accessing this Whiskey Creek foot access point are out here because the little neck clams are very abundant in this region of the bay. And so people usually are coming out here specifically to clam little necks. Interesting fact is that they're both native and non-native little necks found in this section of the bay, and that as a recreational clammer, you don't have to distinguish between the 2 little neck species. Just know that they both count towards the 20 clam limit per person. It's actually one of the few populations of the Manila little neck clam that's self-sustaining within Oregon estuaries. So all these maps that I've been showing you tonight are from the ODFW Clamming Maps brochure for Netarts Bay, which can be picked up either from the Tillamook ODFW office on 3rd Street or downloaded directly from the Seeker website. Before I finish my talk this evening, I wanted to talk briefly about shellfish safety. There are some marine biotoxins that can be found in some shellfish species in Oregon. ODFW works with the Oregon Department of Agriculture to test clams and other shellfish for biotoxins that can have an impact on human health. You should call the Shellfish Hotline, which is shown here, and you can just look. If you don't remember this number, it's in all of our brochures, and if you just search for Oregon Shellfish Hotline, it'll come up as the first search item online as well. You should always call that before you go out harvesting shellfish, since it'll tell you what is closed. So one of the most common biotoxins in recent years is Domoic Acid, which causes amnesiac shellfish poisoning. This biotoxin is a natural product of growth by this diatom here, Pseudonychia, which is a naturally occurring species in Oregon coastal waters. Domoic acid levels were very high during the recent warm blob events in the Pacific and have had impacts on both Dungeness crab and razor clam fisheries of the state, which had to be shut down for extended periods during really, really bad domoic acid events. The other major biotoxin that occurs in Oregon waters is Saxotoxin, which is produced by this phytoplankton, a Dinoflagellate alexandrium. This causes paralytic shellfish poisoning and impacts primarily razor clams and mussels. Both of these biotoxins cannot be degraded by heat, so cooking shellfish does not reduce your risk of exposure. So if you are harvesting any of these shellfish species, make sure that you call the Shellfish Hotline before you go out to harvest them. The good news is that bay clams, that is the main focus of our talk today, do not typically accumulate these biotoxins, and we have not had to shut down bay clamming, even when shellfish on the outer beaches or razor clamming and mussels have been closed on the outer beaches. We have not seen those levels actually occur within bay clams. So I hope you learned something about clams and clamming tonight. Feel free to ask questions through the Facebook Live comment section, and I'll attempt to answer as many of them I can in the next short amount of time. You can always email me at the Seeker email address, and I attempt to get back to the questions that people send to that address within a day or so, if you have anything. So with that, I'll let Chrissy help me field some questions.
Let's see. Okay. Thanks, Tony. That was great. And we did get some questions. So I chatted them to you so you can see them, but also I will we'll read some to you. So some were about, digging clams in general. One question was, can a razor clam gun work for a deeper bay clam?
Not as effectively as it does for razor clams, because the way that the razor clam gun is designed is that because the razor clams dig so much more rapidly than bay clams, you have to get to the depth where the razor clams are, and then you put your thumb over the air hole and you pull out that whole column of sand. And what you would find is if you do that same thing in the estuary, it's hard to pull because now it's going to be muddy sand that column is there. It's a lot heavier, and it's also really hard to pull that out of the sediment, and you're more likely to kind of hurt your back in that process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So I had another question from David, and he asked, "Is there a trick to digging for clams in rocky areas such as the Happy Camp Beach?"
Yeah, there is. I tend to only use the for real shovel for maybe the first one, and I tend to actually use kind of like a garden, like a hand garden rake that you would use, like the little 3-pronged hand rakes, because you can get them in stainless steel, so they won't really rust that much, and it really helps to move a lot of the cobble and stuff around, and makes it so that you're not damaging your hands if you're trying to move a lot of that material by hand, since it's harder to really dig in those areas.
Great. So I had we had a few other questions. Pulling them up now. So I had a question from Kim. I'm sorry, my cat's making an appearance. And she's wondering, do soft shell eastern clams have problems with Domoic acid as well?
Not that we've measured, albeit I will admit that for soft shell clams, they aren't measured as often as like razor clams and mussels are collected for that type of measurement, just because they've rarely been found. So they aren't tested as frequently as, their razor clams and mussels are always collected, and then bay clams and soft shell clams are more intermittently collected, just to make sure that we're still not measuring detectable levels of the biotoxins.
Great. So then another question, which I actually think is a really great one from Cliff. He said, he asked, can you talk about keeping the first ones you find or going after larger clams? What is allowed? And does this harm kill the clams?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for different clams, the rules on whether you have to take the first clams you get, or every clam you get, versus being able to return them differs by the species. So for example, if you were digging bay clams and you had cockles or butter clams or little neck clams in your bucket, and then you found another clam that you wanted instead, those are ones that can be returned to the tide flat. And the reason for that is that those species can reburrow pretty easily and reestablish themselves. The one bay clam that you cannot return is the gaper clam. And the main reason for that is that gaper clams can only actively burrow when they're young clams. So by the time they're a juvenile clam, they can't re-bury themselves into the tide flat. And so if you were to try to return an older gaper clam, it can't reburrow itself. So if you leave it behind in the tide flat, you would actually be, that clam would be eaten by crabs or birds or whatever. You wouldn't actually be returning it to the tide flat. And so that's a reason for why the gaper clams can't be returned. You have to keep every gaper clam that you collect.
Great. That's a great answer. It was a good question too.
Yeah.
Here's another one that I get debated on a lot. Are there gooey ducks in Netarts Bay?
Yes, they're very, 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 very rare. I think I will say that, so, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the next talk, but we had something like 700 or so sites that we sampled in Netarts Bay, and we didn't get a gooey duck in any of them. However, we do have at least one or two confirmed gooey ducks from recreational clammers from Netarts Bay. So we know that they do occur there. They're just extremely rare. And, if anybody has been in Washington and dug gooey ducks, it's a lot of work, because they can be much deeper than 3 feet down. So they do occur in Oregon. They're just not, they're rare, and they don't have the big populations that Washington State is known for.
That's a great answer. How many times have you seen a gooey duck?
In 10 years, we've only collected one gooey duck in the Secret Project, and it was from Coos Bay, not Netarts Bay. But I've personally seen 3 others from recreational users that were asking us at the boat launch or tide flat areas, just confirmation that that's what they found.
It's really interesting. I'm wondering what kind of historic information there might be on gooey duck populations.
Yeah. it's interesting because like even in the old ODFW shellfish records that go back to like the 1950s, there are occasional times where the program went out just to dig areas where folks have said there might be gooey ducks, just to kind of see what might be in those areas.
Huh. It's really interesting. Have you found one in Tillamook Bay? Just Coos Bay, right?
Just Coos Bay.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Let me go back and check and see if we've got some more good questions here. What if you break a shell on a clam when you're harvesting it? Will it die if you return it?
It likely would die if you return it. That doesn't mean you can't, except if it's a gaper. I mean, obviously, if it's a gaper clam, you have to keep it no matter what condition it's in. We recommend that if you do break a clam, that you keep that. The only thing, it's still completely edible and it's completely safe to eat. The only thing is it has to be cleaned and cooked fairly quickly after you collect it.
Great. So let me go back and check again. So do you have any recommendations for people once they harvest, how to take them off the beach, and how long they can safely store them?
Yeah, so in general, the best way to store them is like in a bag, or like a plastic bag or something over ice, as opposed to, for example, in a bucket of water. The main reason being that with all of the clams kind of breathing and pumping water within the bucket of water, if you're not actively aerating that water, that water can go anoxic and kill all the clams. Whereas over ice, if you cool the clams down, they'll actually just close their shells and then they can last for quite some time. You know, that's the reason why if you were to go to the grocery store or a seafood place, that's how you see like the Manila little necks, you know, the steamer clams that you would buy. They're just basically in a mesh bag over ice because they can last quite long in that state. So I would usually just have a cooler to transfer them to when you come back from the tide flat.
Great. Somebody else enjoyed my cat, apparently. So I'm trying to navigate through how to find all our comments aren't showing up. So I'm just going to take a second here and scan through. Oh, there we go. Okay, here I'm seeing the rest of them now. So another question is, do you have any recommendations for how to get the sand out? We've heard you should let them sit for 24 hours.
Yeah, it depends on what your plan is. I usually try to do that and let them sit for 24 hours to clear. It doesn't always work. I think for me, most of the sand is not the sand that's actually in the clams themselves. It's like sand and mud that's on the shell and just inside the shell, but not on the actual meat of the clam. So really, it's like very well rinsed or scrubbing the outside of the shells before you start cooking them, and that's where most of that sand and grit is, because they don't actually take sand in when they actually feed with that. So that's not as much of an issue from that. So the main issue there is more cleaning and rinsing the clams before you put them into whatever dish that you're planning to use the clams in.
All right. So I have one more question before you go, if you have it for me. And I like that somebody else asked it, because I was going to ask it too. What is your favorite clam to eat? And I'm going to add to that, how do you like to prepare it?
Okay. Butter clams are my favorite, which is part of the reason that Netarts is one of my favorite bays, because it has one of the largest butter clam populations among all the estuaries that my group has worked in. And then I do a mixture of um, baked open face in the shell and chowder, of course, and then some fritters, but the first two are my most favorite ways of preparing them.
Thank you so much for giving us your evening. It was really great to capture all this information. I wish that we were doing this in person and we got to go clamming tomorrow. That would have been really amazing, but this was certainly really informative, and it seems like everybody had a good time listening to what you had to say. So thanks again for your time.
Oh, no problem. I always enjoy these.
That's perfect. All right. Well, good night, everybody. And we'll see you again sometime soon, hopefully on the bay, but certainly you can join us virtually until we can make that happen. So, all right. Good night.